Hey there. Tonight, we find ourselves in a time when justice meant spectacle, and someone had to swing the axe. But what if that someone had a conscience and a tendency to overthink murder before breakfast? Drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I always love seeing this little time-traveling community gathering here from all over the world. Now, dim the lights, tuck yourself in, and let's drift far, far away. You wake up in medieval England and immediately wish you hadn't. It's not just that your straw mattress feels like sleeping on a pile of angry twigs, or that the rats in your walls are having what sounds like a full-scale territorial war. It's not even that your house smells like a combination of unwashed humanity, rotting vegetables, and whatever died in your neighbor's pig pen last week. No. The real problem is that you're about to spend another day professionally ending people's lives, and you're cursed with the kind of moral compass that makes you feel bad about squashing spiders. Welcome to your life as England's most reluctant executioner. You're basically the medieval equivalent of a therapy patient who accidentally stumbled into a slasher film and can't find the exit. Your alarm clock is a rooster that sounds like it's being strangled, which is ironic considering your line of work. You roll out of bed, and by bed we mean a wooden frame with some straw that's seen better centuries, and immediately step in something wet. You hope it's water. It's probably not water. The first order of business is getting dressed, which in medieval times means layering yourself in enough scratchy wool to make a sheep file a harassment complaint. Your work outfit consists of a leather apron, the medieval equivalent of scrubs, except designed to hide bloodstains instead of looking professional, some boots that have seen more gore than a Game of Thrones finale, and a hood, not because you're going for the mysterious executioner aesthetic, though that's a nice bonus, but because people tend to hold grudges against the guy who separated their cousin from his head, and anonymity helps you avoid awkward encounters at the market. You splash some water on your face from a basin that doubles as your kitchen sink, bathroom sink, and occasional emergency chamber pot. The water is roughly the temperature and clarity of peasant soup, which is to say questionable on all fronts. You don't brush your teeth because toothbrushes won't be invented for another few centuries. And honestly, given what you're about to witness today, having a numb mouth might be a blessing. Breakfast is a chunk of bread that could double as a weapon, and some ale that tastes like someone accidentally fermented their laundry water. You eat standing up because sitting down would require acknowledging that this is your life now, and you're not quite ready for that level of self-awareness. As you chew your way through what might generously be called food, you review today's schedule. 3 executions, 1 thief, caught stealing a loaf of bread worth approximately 12 cents in today's money, 1 adulterer, because apparently medieval society had very strong opinions about who you could sleep with, and 1 heretic, whose crime was suggesting that maybe the church had gotten a few things wrong. You know all this because you actually read the charges. Unlike most of your colleagues who just show up and start chopping, this is where having a conscience becomes a real career liability. Your office is the town square, which means your commute involves walking through streets that make a modern landfill look like a 5-star resort. Medieval city planning was apparently designed by someone who thought, you know what would make urban living perfect? If we just threw all our garbage directly outside our front doors and let nature sort it out. You dodge horse manure, the medieval equivalent of potholes, human waste, because indoor plumbing is still a pipe dream, pun intended, and the occasional dead animal that someone's decided is tomorrow's problem. The smell is so overwhelming that you actually start to miss the comforting scent of your own unwashed clothes. People avoid eye contact with you as you pass, which would be great for your social anxiety if it weren't because they're terrified of you. You're basically the human embodiment of everyone's worst Monday morning, except instead of being stuck in traffic, they're contemplating their own mortality. Kids stop playing when they see you coming, dogs hide, and merchants suddenly find their shoes very interesting. You want to stop and explain that you're actually a pretty nice guy who cries during sad movies. If movies existed, and has never even successfully killed a spider without feeling guilty about it for weeks, But medieval society isn't big on nuanced character development, so you're stuck being the neighborhood boogeyman who happens to have a very unfortunate day job. The town square is already buzzing with activity when you arrive, and by buzzing we mean it's literally buzzing with flies, because medieval sanitation was about as effective as using a colander as an umbrella. There's your executioner's block, sitting there like the world's most morbid office desk, surrounded by a crowd of people who are way too excited about watching other people die. Your office supplies consist of an axe that you've named Regret, a sword called Please Don't Make Me Use This Again, and a collection of ropes that you've avoided naming because that would make things too personal. Everything is kept in a shed that doubles as a storage unit for torture devices, which makes going to work feel like walking into a medieval Home Depot designed by someone with serious psychological issues. The executioner's block is your desk, podium and stage all rolled into one blood-stained piece of wood that's seen more drama than a reality TV show. It's positioned for maximum visibility because apparently public executions were the medieval equivalent of appointment television. You've got front row seats to humanity's worst day, and somehow you're also the main event. Your boss is technically the local lord, but practically speaking, you report to an entire town full of people who want entertainment and don't particularly care about your job satisfaction. There's no employee handbook, no benefits package, and definitely no mental health support. Your retirement plan is basically try not to get murdered by angry relatives of your victims. The crowd today is typical. A mix of people who are bored, bloodthirsty, or both. There's the baker who always shows up because business is slow, and watching people die is apparently more interesting than making bread. There's the group of teenagers who think public executions are edgy entertainment, the medieval equivalent of kids who think horror movies are cool. And there's always at least one person who brings their lunch and treats the whole thing like a picnic with a side of homicide. You look at your equipment one more time, hoping that maybe today you'll discover you've been having an elaborate nightmare and will wake up as a nice normal medieval person with a sensible job like plague, doctor or professional leech collector. No such luck. Your first appointment is Thomas the Bread Thief, a guy whose biggest crime was being hungry in a society that treated poverty like a personal character flaw. He's about your age, has the kind of hollow-eyed look that comes from chronic malnutrition, and is shaking so hard you worry he might vibrate himself to death before you get a chance to fulfill your professional obligations. The charges are read aloud by a court official, who sounds bored enough to be announcing train delays. Thomas stole a loaf of bread worth approximately what you'd spend on a pack of gum today, but in medieval justice terms this makes him roughly equivalent to a bank robber. The punishment fits the crime about as well as a medieval chastity belt fits modern fashion trends. You're supposed to give Thomas a chance to say his last words, which is the medieval equivalent of asking someone to write their own Yelp review before you ruin their entire experience of being alive. He mumbles something about his family, his children, and how he was just trying to keep them from starving. It's the kind of heartbreaking speech that would make you want to quit your job and become a medieval social worker. If medieval social work existed and wasn't just try not to die of plague. The crowd is getting restless. They didn't come here for a sociology lesson on economic inequality. They came for violence. Someone shouts, "Get on with it," which is medieval for we have the attention span of goldfish and demand immediate gratification. You look at Thomas, who's looking at you with the kind of expression that suggests he's hoping you'll suddenly discover a moral backbone and refuse to go through with this. You look at the crowd, who are looking at you like you're Netflix and they're waiting for you to buffer properly. You look at your axe, which is looking at you like an inanimate object because it's an axe. This is where having a conscience becomes less like a character trait and more like a chronic medical condition. You know that refusing to do your job would result in you becoming intimately familiar with your own executioner's block, which would solve the moral dilemma, but create a whole new set of practical problems. You also know that going through with it means you'll spend the rest of the day feeling like you've personally contributed to making the world a worse place, which is not great for your already fragile mental health. The medieval justice system doesn't really leave room for conscientious objectors. It's more of a do your job or become your job kind of situation. So you do what you always do. You apologize quietly to Thomas, who probably can't hear you over his own terror, and you try to make it as quick and clean as possible. You've gotten good at the technical aspects of your job, because if you're going to ruin someone's day forever, the least you can do is be efficient about it. The crowd cheers like they're at a sporting event where the home team just scored, which makes you feel approximately as good as you'd expect. Thomas's family isn't in attendance, which is a small mercy because watching people grieve the loss of someone whose crime was being hungry would probably push you over the edge from depressed executioner to executioner who needs to be executed for having a complete mental breakdown in public. 1 down, 2 to go. You clean your axe and try not to think about how Thomas probably had the same breakfast routine you do, probably worried about the same kinds of things, probably had dreams and hopes and fears that were now permanently interrupted. You're basically a medieval grief counselor, except instead of helping people process loss, you're creating it. It's like being a therapist in reverse. Customer number 2 is Margaret the adulterer, whose crime was having sex with someone who wasn't her husband. In today's world, this would be grounds for an awkward conversation, possibly some marriage counseling, and maybe a very uncomfortable episode of a daytime talk show. In medieval times, it's apparently grounds for losing your head, which seems like a disproportionate response to relationship drama. Margaret is older than Thomas, probably in her 30s, which in medieval terms makes her practically elderly. She's got the kind of defiant look that suggests she's not particularly sorry about what she did, which you actually find kind of admirable. If you're going to die for your choices, you might as well own them. The backstory, as read by the same board court official, is that Margaret's husband was apparently about as sexually appealing as a medieval tax collector, and had the personality of wet wool. She found companionship with someone else, got caught, and now she's here because medieval society believed that a woman's sexual choices were everyone's business except her own. You want to point out that her husband is probably the kind of guy who thinks foreplay is asking, "Are you awake?" And that maybe the real crime here is the complete lack of marriage counseling resources in medieval society. But social commentary isn't part of your job description, and honestly, your job description is depressing enough without adding editorial duties. Margaret gets to make her last statement, which she uses to deliver what amounts to a medieval TED talk on the double standards of sexual morality. She points out that her lover isn't also being executed, which is a pretty solid point about gender inequality in justice systems. She also mentions that her husband hasn't exactly been a model of fidelity himself, which is the kind of information that would have been useful during the trial, but apparently wasn't considered relevant. The crowd is less enthusiastic about Margaret than they were about Thomas, which probably says something about medieval attitudes toward women who don't quietly accept their circumstances. Some people are actively hostile, shouting things that would get them banned from every social media platform simultaneously if social media existed. You're starting to realize that your job isn't just about ending lives. It's about enforcing social control through terror. You're basically a walking reminder that stepping outside society's very narrow definition of acceptable behavior has permanent consequences. It's like being a hall monitor, except the detention is death and there's no appeals process. Margaret looks at you with a mixture of resignation and pity, which is unsettling because usually you're the one feeling sorry for other people. She seems to understand that you're just as trapped in this system as she is, except your cage is made of social expectations and economic necessity instead of legal charges. "I forgive you," she says, which is probably the most devastating thing anyone has ever said to you professionally. It's the kind of statement that makes you question not just your career choices, but your entire understanding of morality, justice, and what it means to be human. You do your job. But this time it feels less like following orders and more like participating in something fundamentally wrong. The crowd's reaction is more subdued, possibly because even medieval people sometimes recognize the difference between justice and revenge. 2 down, 1 to go. You're starting to understand why medieval executioners had a life expectancy roughly equivalent to that of professional volcano inspectors. Your final appointment is Brother Francis the heretic, whose crime was suggesting that maybe the church's interpretation of certain religious texts wasn't absolutely perfect. In modern times, this would make him a theology professor or a blogger with controversial opinions. In medieval times, it makes him eligible for your services, which seems like another example of medieval society's tendency to respond to minor disagreements with extreme violence. Brother Francis is actually a monk, which adds an extra layer of irony to the situation. He spent his life serving God, but apparently he served God in the wrong way, or asked the wrong questions, or read the wrong books. He's got the kind of calm demeanor that suggests he's made peace with his situation, which is more than you can say for yourself. The charges against Brother Francis are read in Latin, which most of the crowd doesn't understand, but everyone nods along anyway because admitting you don't speak Latin in medieval times is like admitting you don't know how to use a smartphone in 2025. The basic gist is that he questioned some church doctrine, wrote some letters that church officials didn't like, and generally behaved like someone who thought religious truth might be more complicated than whatever the church says is automatically correct. You're starting to notice a pattern in today's executions. All three people were basically guilty of being human in a society that demanded perfection according to very specific and often contradictory rules. Thomas was guilty of being hungry, Margaret was guilty of being unsatisfied, and Francis was guilty of being curious. None of these seem like capital offences, but medieval justice wasn't particularly interested in your opinion. Brother Francis uses his last words to deliver what amounts to a medieval sermon on compassion, forgiveness, and the importance of questioning authority. It's the kind of speech that would get standing ovations if it were delivered at a modern university. But here it just makes people uncomfortable, because it forces them to think about what they're witnessing. He looks directly at you during part of his speech, and you realize he's not just talking to the crowd, he's talking to you. He's trying to help you process the moral weight of what you're doing, which is either incredibly kind or incredibly cruel, depending on your perspective. We are all prisoners of systems larger than ourselves, he says, which hits way too close to home for someone who's trying to get through the workday without having a complete existential crisis. The crowd is definitely uncomfortable now. Religious executions are always tricky, because they force people to confront the possibility that they're watching someone die for beliefs that might actually be correct. It's like cancelling someone on medieval Twitter, except the consequences are permanent, and there's no way to delete your participation later. You realize that Brother Francis is probably smarter than everyone else in the square combined, including you. He's thought deeply about life, death, morality, and justice. While you've spent your career trying not to think about any of those things because thinking makes your job impossible to do, when you finally fulfill your professional obligations, it feels less like completing a task and more like participating in the destruction of something valuable and irreplaceable. The crowd disperses quickly and quietly, which suggests that even medieval people sometimes recognize when they've witnessed something that crossed the line from justice into tragedy. 3 down, workday over. You clean your equipment and pack it away, trying not to think about the fact that you've just eliminated 3 human beings whose combined crimes were hunger, loneliness, and intellectual curiosity. Your workday is technically over, but the psychological weight of what you've done is just getting started. You walk home through the same streets you traveled this morning, but now they feel different. Every person you pass could be tomorrow's customer. Every conversation you overhear could be evidence of crimes that will eventually land someone on your executioner's block. You start to see the town differently when your job is ending the lives of its residents. That baker who was in the crowd today, he probably waters down his bread dough, which is technically fraud. The merchant at the corner, he's definitely been creative with his weights and measures. The priest at the local church, he's probably got opinions about doctrine that he's smart enough to keep to himself. Everyone is potentially guilty of something, and you're the guy who will eventually have to do something about it. You stop by the tavern, hoping that alcohol will help you forget the day. But medieval ale is roughly as effective as drinking flavoured water for psychological pain management. Plus, the tavern is full of people who were in the crowd today, and they look at you with a mixture of fear and fascination that makes you feel like a celebrity at the world's most depressing fan convention. The tavern keeper serves you without making eye contact, which is standard treatment for someone in your profession. You're like a necessary evil that everyone depends on but no one wants to acknowledge. You're the medieval equivalent of a garbage collector, except instead of disposing of waste, you dispose of people. And instead of being appreciated for providing an essential service, you're treated like you're personally responsible for the need for your services. You sit alone at a table in the corner, nursing your terrible ail and trying not to make eye contact with anyone. Conversations stop when people notice you, then resume in whispers that you're probably better off not hearing. You're like a walking reminder of mortality, except instead of inspiring people to live their best lives, you mostly just make them nervous about their worst choices. A group of young men at another table starts talking louder, clearly trying to impress their friends with their opinions about today's executions. They're the medieval equivalent of internet commenters, full of strong opinions about situations they don't understand, and confident that they would handle everything better if they were in charge. "That bread thief got what he deserved," one of them says, apparently unaware that he's speaking loud enough for you to hear. Can't have people thinking they can just take whatever they want. You want to point out that Thomas wasn't exactly planning to build a criminal empire based on stolen carbohydrates. But engaging with tavern philosophers is not a good career move for someone in your position. Instead, you finish your ale and head home, leaving them to solve the world's problems with the confidence that comes from never having to implement their solutions. Home is a relative term for someone whose neighbors actively avoid making eye contact with them. But it's the place where you keep your stuff and try to sleep, so it'll have to do. Your house is small, dark, and furnished with the kind of basic necessities that suggest someone who has given up on interior decorating and focused entirely on basic survival. You light a candle, which is your version of turning on the lights. Except the candle costs about what you make in half a day, and provides roughly as much illumination as a firefly with depression. The flame casts shadows that make everything look ominous, which is perfect for your current mood, but terrible for your mental health. Dinner is more bread, some cheese that tastes like it was aged in a sock, and vegetables that have seen better decades. You eat mechanically, trying not to think about the fact that Thomas died for stealing food that wasn't much better than what you're currently choking down. Medieval cuisine was apparently designed by people who thought flavor was a character weakness and nutrition was optional. You try to read. But books are expensive, and literacy is optional for executioners. So your reading material consists mainly of execution orders and court documents. It's like trying to relax by reading your work emails. Except your work emails are death sentences, and there's no HR department to complain to about workplace stress. You attempt to pray, but talking to God when your job involves killing his creations in his name feels like a conversation that might get awkward fast. Medieval theology was complicated enough without adding the philosophical questions that come with being professionally responsible for sending people to meet their maker ahead of schedule. You lie down on your straw mattress and stare at the ceiling, which is made of the same wood as your executioner's block, and serves as a constant reminder of your day job. The rats in your walls are having another territorial dispute, which sounds like the kind of violence you'd like to avoid, but can't seem to escape even at home. Sleep doesn't come easily when your profession involves ending other people's ability to sleep forever. You lie awake thinking about Thomas's family, wondering if they're lying awake too, thinking about him. You think about Margaret's husband, wondering if he feels guilty or vindicated or just confused about how a marriage dispute became a capital case. You think about Brother Francis's fellow monks, wondering if they're questioning their own beliefs or just grateful they kept their doubts to themselves. You think about tomorrow's schedule, which includes 2 more executions, a poacher who was caught hunting deer on the Lord's land, and a woman accused of witchcraft because she was good at herbal medicine and had the misfortune of treating someone who died anyway. Neither case seems particularly clear-cut, but medieval justice wasn't known for its nuanced approach to complex situations. You finally fall asleep sometime after midnight, and immediately start having nightmares about work. which means even your unconscious mind can't escape the psychological weight of your chosen profession. You dream about executioners' blocks that chase you through town squares, and axes that refuse to work properly, and crowds that turn into angry mobs when you can't provide the entertainment they expect. Your social calendar is emptier than a medieval dentist's appointment book, which is probably for the best, since most social activities involve people who would prefer not to associate with someone who kills people for a living. Dating is particularly challenging when your job requires you to wear a hood for professional anonymity, and your hands permanently smell like iron and regret. The few people who do interact with you fall into specific categories. Other executioners, who are either completely desensitized to the work and therefore depressing to be around, or struggling with the same moral conflicts you are, and therefore depressing in a different way. Prostitutes, who are professional enough to separate business from personal feelings, but not particularly interested in long-term relationships. And clergy, who seem to think you need spiritual guidance but aren't sure whether to treat you as a sinner who needs saving or a necessary evil who serves God's justice. You occasionally attend public gatherings like festivals or market days, but you're like the medieval equivalent of a police officer at a house party. Your presence changes the entire dynamic and makes everyone hyper-aware of rules they usually ignore. People watch their language around you, avoid discussing anything that might be construed as criminal, and generally behave like they're worried you might be taking notes for future reference. The isolation is probably the worst part of the job, worse even than the actual killing. Humans are social creatures, and being cut off from normal social connections makes everything else harder to bear. You're like a medieval hermit, except instead of choosing solitude for spiritual reasons, you're alone because your job makes you unemployable as a friend. You've tried joining various social groups, the local craftsmen's guild, the church choir, even a group that meets to discuss philosophy. But everywhere you go, your profession follows you like a particularly persistent and unwelcome shadow. People can't see past what you do for a living, which means they can't see you as a person who has interests, opinions, and feelings that have nothing to do with professional execution. The loneliness is compounded by the fact that you can't really complain about it without sounding ridiculous. I'm sad because people don't want to be friends with someone who cuts off heads for money. Isn't the kind of problem that generates a lot of sympathy, even from people who might otherwise be compassionate about social isolation. You've considered changing careers, but medieval job mobility was roughly as flexible as medieval armor, and executioner isn't exactly the kind of experience that transfers well to other fields. Previous job, professional killer, doesn't open a lot of doors in the medieval employment market, and your skills are unfortunately very specialized. So you spend most of your free time alone, which gives you plenty of opportunity to think about your life choices, contemplate the moral implications of your work, and generally spiral into the kind of existential despair that would benefit from therapy if therapy existed, and wasn't just pray harder and hope God fixes it. Your salary is determined by the local lord, who apparently believes that moral flexibility should come cheap and psychological trauma is just part of the job benefits. You're paid per execution, which means your income fluctuates based on how violent society is feeling at any given time. It's like being a freelance contractor, except your clients are all having the worst day of their lives, and your product is permanent. The pay structure is approximately equivalent to what a skilled craftsman makes, which sounds reasonable until you consider that skilled craftsmen don't have to live with the psychological weight of their work or deal with the social isolation that comes with your particular skill set. A blacksmith goes home at the end of the day knowing he's created something useful. You go home knowing you've eliminated something irreplaceable. You also have to provide your own equipment, which means you're essentially a small business owner whose overhead includes axes, swords, ropes, and the occasional replacement executioner's block when the old one gets too stained to be considered professional. It's like being required to buy your own office supplies, except your office supplies are specifically designed for killing people, and they're not tax deductible. There are no benefits, no health insurance, because medieval healthcare consisted mainly of praying and hoping for the best. No retirement plan, because medieval retirement planning was try not to die before you get too old to work. and definitely no mental health coverage, because medieval mental health treatment was "have you tried not being sad?" Job security is theoretically good, since there's always someone who needs executing, but it's also precarious because your employment depends on maintaining the favor of local authorities, who might decide you're too sympathetic to your victims or not enthusiastic enough about your work. Plus, there's always the risk that political situations will change, and you'll find yourself on the wrong side of whoever's currently in charge. You can't really negotiate for better pay or working conditions because you're not exactly in a position to threaten to quit and take your skills elsewhere. There aren't competing employers bidding for experienced executioners, and starting your own execution business would require political connections you don't have, and startup capital you can't afford. The financial stress adds another layer to the psychological burden of your job. You're not just killing people for moral reasons or social justice. You're killing people because you need the money to survive, which makes you feel like a mercenary who's lost sight of any higher purpose your work might theoretically serve. You've calculated that you'd need to execute approximately one person per week to maintain a basic medieval standard of living, which means you're literally dependent on a steady stream of human misery to pay your rent. It's like being a medieval crisis counselor, except instead of helping people through their problems, you're the final solution to their problems. Learning to be an executioner is not like learning other medieval trades, where you can apprentice with a master craftsman and gradually develop your skills over time. Instead, you're basically thrown into the deep end of a very shallow pool, and expected to figure out how to not make a complete mess of people's final moments. Your predecessor was an older man who died of what was probably alcoholism but was officially listed as natural causes, because medieval medical diagnosis was about as precise as medieval weather forecasting. He left behind his equipment and a piece of advice: make it quick, keep it clean, and don't think too much. This is roughly equivalent to learning brain surgery from a note that says cut carefully and wash your hands. The technical challenges of your job are more complex than people realize. Different types of executions require different skills, and there's no room for practice runs or trial and error learning. Your first execution is also your final exam, and failure means not just professional embarrassment but public humiliation and possibly criminal charges for incompetence. Axe work requires precision, timing, and the kind of upper body strength that comes from years of physical labor. You have to account for variables like the height of your victim, the sharpness of your blade, the angle of your swing, and the steadiness of your hands. One small mistake can turn a quick death into a prolonged nightmare, which is bad for everyone involved. Hanging is theoretically simpler, but practically more complicated, because the physics of rope, weight, and gravity interact in ways that medieval science wasn't equipped to explain. Too much rope, and the process takes too long. Too little rope, and it doesn't work at all. The knot has to be positioned correctly, the drop has to be calculated properly, and you have to hope that everything works the way it's supposed to on the first try. You've had to become an expert in human anatomy without any formal medical training, because understanding how bodies work is essential for making them stop working efficiently. It's like being a medieval medical student, except instead of learning to heal people, you're learning to kill them quickly and cleanly. The psychological aspects are just as technical as the physical ones. You have to manage your own emotional responses while also dealing with the emotional responses of your victims, their families, and the crowd. You're part executioner, part counselor, part crowd control specialist, and part public performer, all rolled into one psychologically demanding role. Equipment maintenance is an ongoing challenge because medieval metallurgy wasn't known for its durability, and your tools have to be kept in perfect condition for both practical and professional reasons. A dull axe doesn't just make your job harder, it makes it more traumatic for everyone involved, and potentially dangerous for you if the crowd decides you're not providing adequate entertainment value. The legal system that keeps you in business is roughly as fair and rational as a medieval medical treatment, which is to say, it operates on principles that make sense only if you don't think about them too carefully. Laws are made by people with power to control people without power, and justice is administered by people who have never experienced injustice themselves. Most of your customers are poor, which isn't a coincidence. Wealthy people have access to better legal representation, alternative punishments, and the kind of social connections that can make criminal charges disappear like medieval evidence. Poor people get executed. Rich people get fined, exiled, or forced to make charitable donations that coincidentally benefit the same people who determine their punishments. The concept of proportional punishment hasn't really caught on yet, so minor crimes often carry the same penalties as major ones. Stealing bread can get you executed, but so can murder, which suggests that medieval society either took property crime very seriously or human life not seriously enough. Either way, it keeps you busy. Evidence standards are roughly equivalent to medieval hygiene standards, which is to say they exist in theory but are rarely applied in practice. Accusations often carry the same weight as proof. Witnesses can be bought or intimidated, and confessions extracted under torture are considered reliable regardless of the circumstances under which they were obtained. The appeals process is about as effective as medieval pest control, meaning it's theoretically available but practically useless. Once you're scheduled for execution, your main hope is that someone with more power than you decides to intervene, which happens about as often as medieval peasants win the lottery that doesn't exist yet. You've started to notice patterns in the cases that come before you. Crimes that threaten property rights get punished more severely than crimes that threaten human rights. Social control is more important than actual justice, and the appearance of moral authority matters more than the reality of moral behavior. The judges who sentence people to your services are typically local officials who combine legal authority with personal interests in ways that would be considered conflicts of interest if conflicts of interest were considered problematic. They own land, businesses, and sometimes the people who appear before them, which creates incentives that don't necessarily align with impartial justice. You're essentially the enforcement arm of a legal system that's designed to maintain existing power structures rather than provide actual justice, which makes you feel less like a law enforcement officer and more like a tool of political oppression. It's like being a police officer in a system where the laws are written by criminals to criminalize their victims. Religion permeates every aspect of medieval society, including your job, which creates some interesting theological questions that no one seems particularly interested in answering. You're supposed to be serving God's justice while also serving the justice of earthly authorities, and sometimes these two forms of justice don't seem particularly compatible. The Church officially supports your work because it maintains social order and reinforces the idea that earthly authorities derive their power from divine sources. Your job is theoretically part of God's plan for maintaining justice and punishing sin, which would be more comforting if the sins you're punishing weren't things like hunger, loneliness, and intellectual curiosity. You've noticed that religious authorities are very good at finding biblical justification for whatever the secular authorities want to do, which suggests that divine will and human convenience have a remarkable tendency to align. It's almost like God's opinions about justice happen to match exactly with the opinions of people who benefit from the current legal system. The concept of mercy, which is supposedly central to Christian theology, seems to apply mainly to people who can afford to buy indulgences or have connections to church hierarchy. Poor people get justice, rich people get mercy. It's like having a two-tiered salvation system based on your ability to make charitable donations. You're supposed to pray for your victims' souls before executing them, which creates the awkward situation of asking God to forgive people for crimes you're about to punish them for permanently. It's like being a medieval customer service representative who has to apologize for policies they're required to enforce but don't necessarily agree with. The crowd often treats executions as religious events, complete with prayers, hymns, and the kind of ceremonial behavior that suggests they're witnessing something sacred rather than something savage. It's like turning violence into worship, which seems theologically problematic but socially convenient. You've started to wonder whether the God you're supposedly serving would actually approve of your work, or whether you're just participating in a system that uses religious authority to justify secular violence. It's like being a medieval telemarketer for salvation, except instead of selling people something they don't need, you're killing people for crimes they probably didn't deserve to die for. The local priest occasionally visits you to discuss the spiritual aspects of your work, but these conversations tend to be more confusing than comforting. He explains that you're an instrument of divine justice, but also that you should pray for forgiveness for the violence you commit in God's name. It's like being told you're doing God's work while simultaneously being told that God's work requires repentance. Your workplace is about as safe as a medieval medical procedure, which is to say it's actively dangerous and no one seems particularly concerned about improving the situation. The executioner's block is positioned in the middle of a public square with no barriers between you and a crowd that might turn hostile if they decide you're not providing adequate entertainment value. There's no safety equipment beyond your leather apron, which is designed more for keeping blood off your clothes than protecting you from angry relatives of your victims. You're basically performing surgery with an axe in front of an audience that has strong opinions about your technique and no training in constructive criticism. The psychological hazards of your job are completely unrecognized because medieval society hadn't yet discovered that repeatedly killing people might have negative effects on mental health. You're expected to maintain emotional stability while performing emotionally destabilizing work, which is like expecting someone to stay dry while swimming in an ocean of trauma. Your equipment poses its own risks, because medieval metallurgy wasn't known for quality control and workplace accidents involving sharp objects can be career-ending in multiple senses. A poorly balanced axe can result in injuries to yourself, your victim, or random bystanders, none of whom are likely to be understanding about the circumstances. The crowd presents additional safety challenges, because medieval crowds were roughly as predictable as medieval weather, and about twice as violent. If they decide you've done something wrong, executed the wrong person, taken too long, made too much of a mess, or failed to provide sufficient spectacle, they can quickly transform from audience into angry mob. You have no backup, no security, and no emergency procedures beyond try not to get killed while killing other people. It's like being a one-person SWAT team with medieval technology and no training in crowd control, crisis management, or basic self-preservation. The long-term health effects of your job include chronic stress, social isolation, depression, and what would probably be diagnosed as PTSD if PTSD were a recognized medical condition. Instead, you're expected to deal with these symptoms through prayer, alcohol, and the medieval equivalent of walking it off. The career ladder for executioners is more like a career step ladder, with most of the steps missing. You can become more efficient at your current job, but there aren't really promotions available unless you count head executioner as a meaningful advancement, which would require there to be enough execution-related work to justify a management hierarchy. Professional development opportunities are limited to learning new execution techniques, which is like being a medieval IT specialist whose only career growth involves learning additional software programs for the same basic function. You could learn to use a sword instead of an axe, or master the intricacies of hanging, but you're still fundamentally in the business of ending lives. Networking is challenging, because your professional contacts consist mainly of other executioners, legal officials who see you as a necessary evil, and clergy who aren't sure whether to treat you as a colleague or a patient. It's not exactly the kind of professional network that opens doors to exciting new opportunities. You can't really leverage your experience into related fields because expert in human anatomy and crowd psychology with extensive experience in crisis management under pressure doesn't translate well when your expertise comes from cutting off heads in public. Medieval HR departments weren't particularly sophisticated about transferable skills. The retirement plan for executioners is basically hope you save enough money to stop working before you get too old to lift an axe, which isn't particularly reassuring given your current salary and the lack of medieval investment opportunities. There's no pension system, no 401k, and no social security net beyond family members who may or may not want to associate with you. You've considered starting a side business, but most medieval businesses require reputation and social connections that your main job has systematically destroyed. You can't open a restaurant because people associate you with death. You can't become a craftsman because no one wants to buy products made by someone who kills people for a living. And you can't provide services that require trust because trust is not something executioners typically inspire. The most realistic career change would be joining the military, where your comfort with violence might be seen as an asset rather than a liability. But medieval armies weren't known for their job security or their generous compensation packages. Plus, switching from individual killing to mass killing doesn't seem like a significant moral improvement. Your housing situation is complicated by the fact that most people prefer not to live near someone whose job involves professional murder, even when that murder is legally sanctioned and socially necessary. You're like a medieval registered sex offender, except your crime is having an unpopular but legal profession rather than actually breaking any laws. The house you rent is in the part of town where property values are kept low by proximity to undesirable businesses like tanneries, slaughterhouses, and your residents. Your neighbors include people who work with dead animals, dead people, or substances that smell like they should be dead, which creates a sense of community based primarily on shared social rejection. Children are specifically instructed not to play near your house, which means your yard is always quiet, but also creates an atmosphere of isolation that makes your home feel less like a refuge and more like a quarantine zone. You're like a medieval hermit who didn't choose solitude, but had it imposed by social circumstances. Property maintenance is complicated by the fact that no one wants to work on a house owned by an executioner, so you have to do most repairs yourself, or pay extra to find workers who are desperate enough to overlook their personal feelings about your profession. It's like being discriminated against for employment, except in reverse. You can't have guests because most people you might want to invite over are also people who prefer not to be seen associating with you. Social gatherings at your house would be attended entirely by other social outcasts, which would create the medieval equivalent of a support group for people with unpopular jobs. The neighborhood watch actively watches you, but not in a helpful way. They're more concerned about what you might be doing than about protecting you from crime. You're simultaneously the most feared and most vulnerable person in your neighborhood, which is an interesting combination that doesn't contribute positively to your sense of security. Your presence affects the entire neighborhood's reputation, which means your neighbors have legitimate reasons to resent you beyond simple prejudice. Living next to an executioner probably makes it harder to sell houses, attract desirable businesses, or maintain the kind of community atmosphere that most people prefer. Your romantic prospects are roughly as promising as medieval dental care, which is to say they exist in theory, but are largely unpleasant in practice. Dating when you're an executioner is like trying to find love while wearing a sign that says, "I kill people for money," and wondering why you're not getting many second dates. The dating pool for someone in your profession consists mainly of people who are either desperate enough to overlook your job or disturbed enough to find it attractive, neither of which are particularly promising foundations for healthy relationships. You're looking for someone who can see past your profession without being weird about it, which is like looking for a unicorn that's also emotionally available. Conversations about work are unavoidably awkward because you can't really discuss your day without making people uncomfortable. But you also can't avoid the topic entirely because it's your primary source of income and takes up most of your time. How was work today becomes a relationship minefield when your honest answer involves detailed descriptions of recent executions. The physical aspects of your job create additional romantic challenges because your hands permanently smell like iron and leather. Your clothes are stained with substances that are difficult to explain, and you occasionally come home covered in evidence of your profession. It's hard to maintain romantic mystery when your appearance regularly suggests you've been involved in violent activities. You've tried dating people from various social backgrounds, but each group presents unique challenges. Wealthy women won't associate with someone in your social class. Working class women are afraid of someone in your profession, and women from your own social stratum are usually dealing with their own survival issues and don't have time for romantic complications. The few relationships you've attempted have ended badly because it's difficult to maintain emotional intimacy when your job requires you to emotionally distance yourself from human suffering on a regular basis. You're like a medieval therapist who's forgotten how to process emotions because your professional survival depends on suppressing them. Marriage prospects are particularly dim because medieval marriage was as much about economic partnerships as romantic compatibility, and you're not exactly bringing desirable economic prospects to the table. You're more like a liability than an asset in terms of social connections, financial stability, and family reputation. You've considered lying about your profession. But medieval communities are small enough that everyone knows everyone else's business. And being discovered in a lie about something as significant as your job would probably end the relationship more dramatically than being honest from the beginning. Your family's attitude toward your career choice ranges from disappointed to terrified, with occasional stops at confused and angry. They understand that you need to work to survive, but they're not particularly thrilled about the specific type of work you've chosen, especially since your career reflects on their reputation as well as your own. Your parents, if they're still alive, probably spend a lot of time explaining to their friends that you're not a bad person. You just have a bad job. They're like medieval public relations specialists for your personal brand, except your personal brand is professional killer, and their audience is people who think professional killing is morally problematic. Siblings either avoid you entirely or try to maintain relationships while carefully not discussing your work, which creates family gatherings that feel like diplomatic negotiations between hostile nations. Conversations focus on safe topics like weather, local gossip, and farming, while carefully avoiding any mention of your professional activities or their social consequences. Extended family members often use your career as a cautionary tale for their own children. Study hard and learn a trade, or you'll end up like your cousin who cuts off heads for a living. You've become the family example of what happens when life choices go wrong, which is not the legacy most people hope to leave. Family celebrations are complicated by your profession, because people don't know how to act around someone whose job involves killing other people. Even when that killing is legal and socially sanctioned, you're like a beloved relative who happens to be involved in something that makes everyone uncomfortable. Religious family members struggle with the theological implications of your work, trying to reconcile their love for you with their belief that taking human life is morally wrong. They pray for your soul while also hoping you'll find a different career, which creates the awkward situation of being loved and disapproved of simultaneously. Your profession affects your family's social standing in the community, which means your career choices have consequences for people who didn't choose your career. It's like being a medieval influencer, whose brand choices affect their family's reputation, except your brand is violence and the consequences are social isolation. If you have children, you face the additional challenge of explaining your job in age-appropriate terms, while also preparing them for the social consequences of having an executioner as a parent. It's like medieval career counseling in reverse. Instead of helping them choose a profession, you're helping them cope with yours. Your job forces you to confront fundamental questions about life, death, justice, and human nature on a daily basis, which would be intellectually stimulating if it weren't so psychologically devastating. You're like a medieval philosophy student whose final exam involves actually implementing the ethical theories you've been studying. The question of whether your work serves justice or simply serves power becomes increasingly difficult to ignore as you accumulate experience with the legal system. You've seen enough cases to recognize patterns in who gets executed and who gets mercy, and those patterns don't seem to correlate with the severity of crimes or the strength of evidence. You start to wonder whether you're part of a justice system or a control system, whether you're protecting society from dangerous people or protecting powerful people from social change. The difference matters both morally and practically, but it's not the kind of question that medieval society encourages its executioners to ask. The relationship between law and morality becomes increasingly complex when you're required to enforce laws that don't seem to serve moral purposes. You're killing people for breaking rules that seem designed more to maintain social hierarchies than to prevent genuine harm, which makes you feel like an enforcer for an unjust system. You develop your own informal ethical code for how to do your job in ways that minimize harm and preserve as much human dignity as possible under the circumstances. You make executions as quick and clean as you can, you treat your victims with respect, and you refuse to participate in the kind of theatrical cruelty that some crowds seem to expect. The psychological impact of regularly ending human lives while maintaining your own humanity becomes a constant internal struggle. You're trying to preserve your moral center while performing actions that feel fundamentally immoral, which is like trying to stay clean while working in a sewer system. You begin to see your victims not as criminals who deserve punishment, but as people who made mistakes, had bad luck, or simply existed in a system that was designed to grind up people like them. This perspective makes your job harder to do but easier to live with, which is probably not the intended effect. The question of whether you're more evil than the people you execute becomes a source of ongoing internal debate. They broke laws, but you kill people. They harmed individuals, but you participate in systemic violence. They acted from desperation or passion, but you act from calculated professional duty. Your dreams are populated by everyone you've ever executed, which turns sleep into a nightly reunion with your professional victims. They don't usually seem angry in your dreams, more confused about why they had to die, and curious about why you were the one who killed them. It's like hosting a medieval support group for people whose problems you solved by making them permanently worse. Thomas the bread thief appears regularly, still asking why stealing food to feed his family was worth dying for. He's not accusatory, just genuinely puzzled by the logic of a system that values property more than human life. You try to explain that you didn't make the rules, but dream logic doesn't really support rational discourse about social policy. Margaret the adulterer usually shows up to discuss the gender dynamics of medieval justice, pointing out that her male lover is presumably still alive and wondering why her sexual choices were considered everyone else's business. She's become your dream feminist theorist, which is both educational and disturbing. Brother Francis the heretic tends to deliver sermons about forgiveness and the importance of questioning authority, which are exactly the kind of messages you need to hear but can't bear to process. He's like your dream therapist, except he's dead because you killed him, which complicates the therapeutic relationship. Sometimes all your victims appear together in a kind of afterlife tavern where they discuss their experiences with medieval justice and compare notes about their executions. They rate your technique, critique your bedside manner, and generally treat the whole experience like a Yelp review for death services. The worst dreams are the ones where you're scheduled to be executed yourself, usually for the crime of having too much conscience for your chosen profession. You experience the terror, confusion, and desperation that your victims felt, which gives you empathy you don't want and perspective you can't use. You occasionally have dreams where you refuse to perform executions and quit your job, but these dreams always end with you being unable to find alternative employment and starving to death in a ditch somewhere. Even your subconscious understands the economic realities of medieval career mobility. The dreams where you try to save your victims by helping them escape are the most frustrating, because they force you to confront the fact that you could theoretically choose not to participate in their deaths, but practically have no real alternatives that don't result in your own destruction. You wake up the next morning to the same strangled rooster, the same damp straw mattress, and the same sense of dread about facing another day in a job that's slowly destroying your soul, while paying barely enough to keep your body alive. The routine is so familiar, it feels like Groundhog Day. If Groundhog Day involved professional murder and existential crisis, today's schedule includes the poacher and the alleged witch, both of whom probably deserve their fates about as much as yesterday's victims. Which is to say, not at all. You dress in the same blood-stained clothes, eat the same terrible breakfast, and walk through the same filthy streets to the same town square, where the same crowd will gather to watch you end the same kinds of lives for the same questionable reasons. The poacher turns out to be a father of 6 who was trying to supplement his family's diet with deer that belonged to a lord who owns more land than he could personally use in several lifetimes. The witch is an elderly woman whose crime was being knowledgeable about herbal medicine in a society that preferred to attribute medical knowledge to either divine intervention or demonic influence. You perform your professional duties with the same competence and reluctance as always, trying to maintain the technical standards of your work while ignoring the moral implications of what you're doing. The crowd reacts with the same bloodthirsty enthusiasm. The victims die with the same confused terror. and you go home with the same psychological burden increased by 2 more lives. The cycle repeats day after day, week after week, month after month, with only minor variations in the specific crimes and personalities involved. You're like a medieval assembly line worker, except instead of producing products, you're producing corpses, and instead of building something useful, you're participating in something that feels increasingly pointless and cruel. You start to understand why your predecessor drank himself to death. Not because he couldn't do the job, but because he couldn't live with doing it. The work itself becomes routine, but the weight of the work accumulates over time, until it becomes unbearable for anyone with sufficient conscience to recognize what they're participating in. You develop strategies for psychological survival, focusing on technique rather than outcomes, treating victims as cases rather than people, and maintaining emotional distance from the human consequences of your professional activities. These strategies help you function but also gradually erode your connection to your own humanity. The money helps you survive physically, but doesn't address the spiritual and emotional costs of your work. You're like a medieval drug dealer who trades pieces of his soul for enough income to keep body and soul together, except the soul part becomes increasingly theoretical over time. So here you are, a medieval executioner with a conscience, trapped in a job that pays barely enough to survive while slowly destroying everything that makes survival worthwhile. You're professionally competent at ending human lives, but personally incompetent at living with the consequences of your competence. Your days are filled with violence that you don't want to commit against people who don't deserve to die, performed for crowds who treat human death as entertainment, in service of a legal system that serves power rather than justice. Your nights are filled with insomnia, nightmares, and the kind of existential despair that comes from participating in something you know is wrong but can't figure out how to stop doing. You've become an expert in human anatomy, crowd psychology, and the technical aspects of efficient killing, but you've lost touch with the parts of yourself that made you human in the first place. Your professional success is measured by your ability to end lives quickly and cleanly, while your personal success is measured by your ability to maintain enough psychological stability to keep showing up for work. The social isolation, economic insecurity, and moral compromise of your position have combined to create a life that's technically sustainable but practically miserable. You're surviving in the most basic sense while failing to thrive in every meaningful way, which is probably the best outcome someone in your situation could realistically expect. You're trapped by economic necessity in a profession that's destroying you psychologically, surrounded by people who fear or despise you professionally while remaining completely dependent on your services socially. You're indispensable and disposable simultaneously, necessary and reviled, skilled and degraded. The medieval world has created a system that needs executioners but doesn't know how to treat them humanely. That depends on violence but doesn't want to acknowledge the human cost of that violence. That values order above justice and fear above compassion. You're both a product and a victim of that system, complicit and trapped, responsible and powerless. Could you survive this? Probably not. At least not without becoming the kind of person you wouldn't want to be. The job would either break your conscience or break your spirit, and either outcome would leave you fundamentally changed in ways that might make survival feel like a questionable victory. Your medieval life as an executioner with a conscience is a daily exercise in moral compromise, psychological endurance, and social isolation that would challenge anyone's ability to maintain their humanity under circumstances designed to destroy it. You're living proof that some jobs are too terrible for decent people to do well, and too necessary for society to eliminate entirely. So the next time you're complaining about your boss, your commute, or your work-life balance, remember that you could be waking up every morning as a medieval executioner, facing another day of professionally sponsored murder in service of a justice system that would make a modern kangaroo court look like a model of fairness and due process. At least your job doesn't require you to kill people before lunch. That's something to be grateful for, right? Young Willem had always been told that God had a plan for everyone. He just never imagined that plan would involve learning to separate heads from shoulders with surgical precision, while maintaining what his master called professional dignity. At 16, Willem was discovering that some career paths come with more psychological baggage than others, and executioner's apprentice was definitely on the heavy end of that spectrum. The morning Willem met Master Aldrich. He thought he was applying to be a blacksmith's assistant. The posting at the tavern had been deliberately vague. Apprentice wanted. Strong back, steady hands, discreet nature required. Speak to Master Aldrich at dawn behind St. Bartholomew's Chapel. Willem had imagined himself learning to forge horseshoes and mend ploughshares, maybe eventually crafting swords for knights and wealthy merchants. He had not imagined himself holding a practice axe while a grizzled man with sad eyes explained the 17 different ways an execution could go catastrophically wrong. The key, Master Aldrich said, running his finger along the blade's edge with the casual familiarity of someone who had been doing this for far too long, is understanding that you're not just ending a life, you're providing a service to the community, closure to victims' families, and hopefully mercy to the condemned. The crowd expects spectacle, but the condemned deserves dignity. Balancing those expectations is what separates a professional from a butcher. Willem stared at the axe in his hands, feeling its weight settle into his palms like a stone of responsibility he wasn't sure he was strong enough to carry. The metal was worn smooth from years of use, and he found himself wondering how many lives had ended against its edge. Master Aldrich noticed his hesitation with the kind of knowing look that suggested he'd had this conversation before. Having second thoughts, boy? I thought I was going to learn metalworking. Master Aldrich laughed, but it was the kind of laughter that suggested he understood exactly why someone might prefer the honest simplicity of beating hot iron into useful shapes, rather than the complex moral mathematics of state-sanctioned killing. This is metalworking in a way. The metal just happens to be applied to people rather than horseshoes. He paused, studying Willem's face with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read fear, resolve, and moral flexibility in the expressions of nervous young men. The work pays well, and there's always demand. More importantly, it needs to be done by someone who cares about doing it right. Too many executioners are either sadists who enjoy the violence or broken men who've stopped caring about anything. Neither serves justice well. Willem had grown up hearing stories about Master Aldrich, how he could take a head clean off with one swing, how he never needed more than a single stroke, how he treated condemned prisoners with more kindness than most people showed their livestock. People respected him in the grudging way they might respect a surgeon who was skilled at amputations, grateful for his competence, but hoping never to need his services personally. "What if I'm not good at it?" Willem asked, which was possibly the worst job interview question in the history of medieval employment. Then people suffer unnecessarily. Their families lose faith in justice, and you drink yourself to death before your 30th birthday. Master Aldrich replied with the cheerful directness of someone who had stopped sugarcoating uncomfortable truths years ago. "But that's why we practice. Here, let me show you the proper stance." The next few hours were like the world's most morbid woodworking lesson. Master Aldrich had Willem practice his swing on a wooden post, adjusting his grip, his stance, the angle of his shoulders, the timing of his follow-through. It was surprisingly technical work, more like learning archery than Willem had expected, requiring precision, consistency, and the kind of muscle memory that could function even when adrenaline and moral horror were making rational thought difficult. The blade has to hit at exactly the right spot, Master Aldrich explained, drawing his finger across the back of Willem's neck in a way that made the boy's skin crawl. Too high and you hit the skull, which stops the blade and turns what should be a quick death into a prolonged nightmare. Too low and you hit the shoulders, which has the same effect but with more screaming. The sweet spot is right here between the third and fourth vertebrae, where the bone is thinnest and the spinal cord is most accessible. Willem tried to focus on the technical aspects of what he was learning, while avoiding the larger implications. It was like studying for a test he hoped he'd never have to take, learning skills he prayed he'd never need to use. But Master Aldrich had made it clear that this was not optional education. Willem would be expected to perform his first execution within the month, and incompetence was not just professionally embarrassing, but actively cruel. "Why did you choose this work?" Willem asked during a break, when they were sitting in the shade behind the chapel, sharing bread and ale that tasted like someone had fermented their disappointment. Master Aldrich was quiet for so long that Willem started to wonder if he'd ask something offensive. When the older man finally spoke, his voice had the kind of weariness that suggested he'd been carrying this story for years without finding anyone he trusted enough to share it with. I didn't choose it. It chose me. He stared at his hands, which were scarred and calloused but surprisingly gentle-looking for instruments of professional death. 20 years ago, our town's executioner was a man named Gareth. Drunk, cruel, incompetent, made executions into torture sessions, drew them out for entertainment. People started to avoid trials, preferring to let criminals escape rather than watch them be slowly butchered in public. Master Aldrich took a long drink of ale before continuing. My younger brother was caught stealing apples from the Lord's orchard. Stupid boy, hungry family, bad choices. Under the law, theft was punishable by death, but most executioners would make it quick for a child, not Gareth. He was drunk, his aim was off, and it took him 4 swings to finish the job. 4 swings, Willem. My brother was 12 years old. Willem felt something cold settle in his stomach as he began to understand the weight of what he was learning. This wasn't just about technique or career training. It was about ensuring that other people wouldn't have to watch their family members die badly because the person responsible for killing them couldn't be bothered to do it competently. I killed Gareth that night. Master Aldrich continued matter-of-factly. Not officially, not legally, just personally. Then I went to the Lord and volunteered for the position. Told him I'd do the job right or not at all. 20 years later, here we are. Do you regret it? Every day. But I'd regret not doing it more. Willem's first execution was scheduled for the following Thursday. A woman named Catherine, who had been convicted of witchcraft after several of her neighbours had accused her of cursing their livestock. The evidence was thin. Some dead chickens, a few sick cows, and the kind of community hysteria that periodically swept through medieval towns like a plague of stupidity. But Catherine was old, poor, and had the misfortune of being knowledgeable about herbal medicine in a society that preferred to attribute unexplained events to supernatural causes rather than natural ones. Master Aldrich spent the week preparing Willem, not just technically but psychologically. They practiced the execution process from beginning to end, how to bind the condemned person's hands, how to position them on the block, how to address the crowd, how to make the final swing count. But more importantly, they talked about how to maintain mental equilibrium while participating in something that felt fundamentally wrong. The key, Master Aldrich explained, is understanding that you're not responsible for the decision to execute someone. That's made by judges, juries, and lawmakers. Your responsibility is ensuring that once that decision has been made, it's carried out with as much dignity and mercy as possible. You're not a killer, you're a craftsman whose craft happens to involve ending lives. Willem tried to find comfort in this distinction, but it felt like the kind of philosophical hair-splitting that might help you sleep at night, but wouldn't necessarily hold up under serious moral scrutiny. He was still going to be the person who separated Catherine's head from her shoulders, regardless of who had made the decision that this was necessary. The night before the execution, Willem couldn't sleep. He lay on his straw mattress listening to rats scurry through the walls and trying to imagine what Catherine was feeling in her cell, knowing that tomorrow would be her last day of being alive. He wondered if she was afraid, if she was angry, if she had made peace with her fate, or was still fighting against the injustice of it. He wondered if she had family who would mourn her, friends who would remember her, or if she would simply disappear from the world without leaving much trace behind. Master Aldrich had told him that thinking too much about the condemned as individual people was a recipe for madness, but Willem found it impossible to think of Catherine as anything else. She wasn't an abstract concept of criminal justice. She was a specific person with a specific history who was going to be specifically dead in less than 12 hours, and he was going to be the reason why. Thursday morning arrived with the same strangled rooster that served as the town's unofficial alarm clock, and Willem discovered that knowing you were going to kill someone that day gave mornings a particularly surreal quality. Everything felt simultaneously more vivid and more distant, as if he were experiencing his life through a thick pane of glass that muffled sounds and blurred edges. He dressed carefully in his apprentice's clothes. a simplified version of Master Aldrich's leather apron and hood, designed to protect him from blood while maintaining the anonymous dignity that executioners were supposed to project. The hood felt strange on his head, transforming him from Willem the blacksmith's son into Willem the apprentice executioner, a role that still felt like an elaborate costume he was wearing for a play he didn't want to be in. The town square was already filling with people when they arrived, and Willem was struck by how festive the atmosphere was. Vendors were selling food and drink, children were running around playing games, and adults were chatting with their neighbors as if they were gathering for a market day rather than a public killing. It was like a community picnic with a side of state-sanctioned murder, and Willem found the disconnect between the social atmosphere and the actual purpose of the gathering deeply unsettling. Catherine was brought out from the jail looking smaller and more fragile than Willem had expected. She was probably in her 60s, with grey hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested a life of hard work and few luxuries. She moved slowly, whether from age, fear, or resignation, Willem couldn't tell. Her hands were bound behind her back, and she was flanked by 2 guards who looked like they were escort duty rather than crowd control. Master Aldrich had explained that the condemned person was usually given a chance to make a final statement, which served multiple purposes. It allowed them to confess their crimes and ask for forgiveness, which was good for community morale. It provided entertainment for the crowd, which was good for maintaining public interest in justice. And it gave the executioner time to prepare mentally for what came next, which was good for ensuring the execution went smoothly. Catherine's final statement was brief and dignity-filled. She maintained her innocence while acknowledging that she had been found guilty by lawful authority, forgave her accusers for their false testimony, and asked God to have mercy on all of them. It was the kind of speech that would have been impressive at a church service, and was absolutely devastating at an execution, because it made it impossible to pretend that the person about to die was anything other than a decent human being caught in circumstances beyond her control. Willem felt his hands shaking as Master Aldrich nodded to him, indicating that it was time for the apprentice to take over. The crowd fell silent, not out of respect but out of anticipation, like an audience waiting for the climax of a play they'd been enjoying. Willem approached Catherine, who looked at him with the kind of calm acceptance that suggested she had made peace with her situation, even if she hadn't made peace with its justice. "I'm sorry," Willem whispered, as he helped her kneel beside the executioner's block. "I know," Catherine replied, and her voice was steady enough that Willem wondered if she was somehow comforting him, rather than the other way around. The actual execution lasted less than 10 seconds. Willem positioned the axe, took a deep breath, and brought it down with all the precision and power Master Aldrich had taught him. His aim was true, his follow-through was clean, and Catherine died instantly without suffering. From a technical standpoint, it was perfect. From every other standpoint, it was the worst moment of Willem's young life. The crowd cheered as if their favourite knight had just won a tournament, and Willem felt something inside him break. Not dramatically, not visibly, but quietly and permanently, like a small bone that cracks under pressure and never quite heals properly. He had done his job competently and mercifully, but that didn't change the fact that he had just killed a woman whose only crime was being different in a society that didn't tolerate difference. Master Aldrich clapped him on the shoulder and whispered, "Well done," but Willem barely heard him over the sound of his own heartbeat, which seemed unnaturally loud in the aftermath of ending someone else's heartbeat forever. The rest of the day passed in a blur of cleanup, equipment maintenance, and the kind of practical details that follow public executions like paperwork after a business meeting. Willem went through the motions automatically, but part of his mind was still kneeling next to Catherine's body, trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. That night, Willem sat in Master Aldrich's workshop, staring at the axe that had made him a killer, and trying to decide whether he could live with being the kind of person who killed people for a living. "It doesn't get easier," Master Aldrich said, apparently reading his thoughts. "If it ever gets easy, that's when you know you need to stop. The day you can take a human life without feeling the weight of it is the day you become the kind of executioner the world doesn't need. How do you bear it? By remembering that someone has to do this work, and if it's not someone who cares about doing it right, it'll be someone who doesn't care at all." Catherine died quickly and with dignity, because we treated her execution as a responsibility rather than an entertainment. That matters, even if it doesn't feel like enough. Willem spent the next several months learning to live with the knowledge that he was capable of killing people when circumstances required it. He performed 6 more executions under Master Aldrich's supervision, each one confirming that he was technically competent at his chosen profession, while also confirming that he would never be emotionally comfortable with it. The condemned prisoners he executed included a horse thief, a tax evader, 2 more alleged witches, a man who had committed adultery with his neighbour's wife, and a teenager who had been caught poaching deer in the Lord's forest. None of them seemed to deserve death more than Catherine had, and all of them died with the kind of confused dignity that suggested they understood the legal necessity of their execution without understanding its moral logic. Willem learned to focus on the technical aspects of his work as a way of avoiding the emotional ones. He became expert at reading crowds, managing logistics, maintaining equipment, and delivering clean, quick deaths. He developed his own pre-execution rituals for maintaining psychological stability, his own methods for dealing with the aftermath of taking lives, and his own strategies for living with a job that required him to be competent at something he wished he never had to do. 6 months after his first execution, Willem was promoted from apprentice to full executioner when Master Aldrich announced his retirement. The older man had saved enough money to buy a small farm outside town, where he planned to grow vegetables and raise chickens and try to forget that he had spent 20 years of his life professionally killing people for the state. "Are you ready for this?" Master Aldrich asked as he handed over the official executioner's license that would make Willem responsible for all capital punishments in their region. Willem looked at the document that officially transformed him from someone who helped kill people into someone who was responsible for killing people, and realized that readiness was probably not the right word for how he felt about his career advancement. "No," he said honestly, "but I'll do it anyway. And that's probably the best anyone can hope for in this line of work." Master Aldrich left town the next week, and Willem never saw him again. There were rumours that he had found peace on his farm, but there were also rumours that he had drunk himself to death within a year of retirement. Willem chose to believe the first rumour, but he understood why the second one was also plausible. Willem served as the town's executioner for the next 15 years, during which time he executed 127 people for crimes ranging from murder to theft, to religious heresy to sexual misconduct. He became known for his competence, his mercy, and his professionalism, but he never became known for his happiness. He married a widow who needed financial security more than romantic love, raised her children as his own, and tried to build a life that included but was not defined by his profession. He trained 3 apprentices during his career, passing on the same technical skills and moral framework that Master Aldrich had taught him. 2 of them completed their training and went on to become executioners in other towns. The third quit after his first execution and became a priest, apparently deciding that spiritual rather than physical death was more appealing as a career focus. Willem retired at 45, having saved enough money to buy a small house in a town where no one knew what he had done for a living. He told people he had been a metal worker, which was technically true even if it didn't capture the full scope of his metalworking experience. He lived quietly for another 20 years, tending a small garden and trying not to think about the 127 people whose lives he had ended in service of a justice system he had never fully understood or approved of. When Willem died in his sleep at the age of 65, the only people who knew his true profession were the handful of former colleagues who attended his funeral. His gravestone identified him as Willem the Craftsman, which was perhaps the most accurate epitaph anyone in his profession could hope for. He had been a craftsman whose craft was death, and he had practiced it with as much skill and mercy as anyone could reasonably expect from someone trapped between the requirements of survival and the demands of conscience. The town found a new executioner within a month of Willem's retirement, because the work always needed doing, and there was always someone desperate or broken enough to do it. The cycle continued, as it had for centuries before Willem and would for centuries after him, because medieval society needed people willing to kill legally and efficiently, even if it didn't quite know how to treat them humanely while they provided that service. Willem's story was neither tragic nor triumphant. It was simply the story of someone who found himself responsible for something terrible and tried to do it as well as possible under impossible circumstances. In a world where good choices were often unavailable, he had tried to make the least bad choices he could manage, and perhaps that was the most anyone could hope for in a profession that existed at the intersection of justice and violence. Lord Justice Roderick Ashworth had always prided himself on his ability to separate emotion from duty, personal feelings from legal necessity, and individual sympathy from societal order. After 23 years on the bench, he had sentenced 312 people to death, and he could remember every single one of them, not because the cases were particularly memorable, but because forgetting seemed like a form of moral cowardice that would make the weight of his decisions too easy to bear. The irony was not lost on him that he had become a judge originally to serve justice, but had discovered that justice and law were not always the same thing, and that serving one sometimes required betraying the other. Medieval legal systems were designed more for maintaining social control than protecting individual rights, and judges were expected to be administrators of existing power structures rather than guardians of abstract moral principles. This morning, like every morning for the past 2 decades, Roderick sat in his private chambers reviewing the day's cases and trying to prepare mentally for the decisions he would be required to make. His breakfast bread, cheese, and watered wine sat untouched on his desk as he read through testimony, evidence, and legal precedents that would help him determine who lived and who died in the coming hours. The first case was depressingly familiar. Thomas Miller, accused of stealing grain from his lord's storehouse. The evidence was solid. Thomas had been caught with the grain, had confessed under questioning, and had no legal defense beyond desperation. His family was starving, his crops had failed, and he had taken what he needed to keep his children alive. Under the law, theft of property worth more than 12 pence was punishable by death, and the grain Thomas had stolen was worth approximately 15 pence. Roderick stared at the case file and felt the familiar weight of institutional obligation pressing against personal conscience. Thomas was clearly guilty of theft, but equally clearly guilty of nothing more than being a father who refused to watch his children starve. The legal remedy was execution. The moral remedy was probably a lecture about better crop rotation and a small fine. Unfortunately, Roderick was a judge in a legal system, not a moral one. The second case was more complex but no less depressing. Margaret Whitmore, accused of adultery with a married man. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Multiple witnesses had seen her entering and leaving the man's house when his wife was absent. Her own behavior had become secretive and defensive, and her husband had testified that their marital relations had become distant and unsatisfactory. Under medieval law, adultery was a crime against the social order, punishable by death, because it threatened the stability of family structures that formed the foundation of feudal society. Roderick had known Margaret personally before her arrest. She was intelligent, kind, and trapped in a marriage to a man who treated her more like livestock than a partner. Her affair was probably the only source of emotional fulfillment she had ever experienced, but emotional fulfillment was not a recognized legal defense against charges of adultery. The law was clear. She had violated her marriage vows, disrupted social order, and must be executed pour encourage a les autres. The third case was the one that had been keeping Roderick awake at night. Brother Francis, a monk accused of heresy for questioning certain aspects of church doctrine in letters he had written to fellow theologians. Francis was one of the most learned men in the region, fluent in Latin and Greek, knowledgeable about philosophy and theology, and genuinely devoted to serving God through intellectual inquiry. His crime was asking questions that church authorities found uncomfortable, and suggesting that some religious truths might be more complex than official doctrine acknowledged. Roderick had read Francis's letters, which were thoughtful, scholarly, and entirely reasonable by any standard of intellectual discourse. They contained no attacks on the Church's authority, no denials of fundamental Christian beliefs, and no attempts to undermine social order. They were simply the work of a curious mind trying to understand divine truth more deeply. Under canon law, however, any questioning of established doctrine could be construed as heresy, and heresy was punishable by death. 3 cases, 3 death sentences, 3 human lives that would end because Roderick followed the law rather than his conscience. It was going to be another typical day in medieval jurisprudence. Roderick had not started his career expecting to become a professional killer with a law degree. He had studied law because he believed in justice, had accepted his judicial appointment because he wanted to serve his community, and had approached his duties with the kind of idealistic enthusiasm that suggested he thought legal systems existed to protect the innocent and punish the guilty according to some rational standard of proportional justice. 23 years of experience had disabused him of most of these romantic notions about jurisprudence. He had learned that laws were written by people with power to control people without power, that justice was administered by people who benefited from existing social arrangements, and that his job was not to determine what was right, but to determine what was legal according to rules he had no role in creating. The transformation from idealistic law student to cynical judicial administrator had been gradual and subtle, like developing a chronic medical condition that slowly drained your vitality without announcing itself dramatically. Roderick could not point to a specific moment when he had stopped believing in the righteousness of his work, but he could clearly see the cumulative effect of 2 decades spent enforcing laws that seemed designed more to maintain inequality than to promote fairness. The first person Roderick had sentenced to death was a horse thief named Edmund, and Roderick could still remember the shock of hearing his own voice pronounce words that would end another human being's life. Edmund was clearly guilty, caught in the act, confessed immediately, offered no defense, but he was also young, frightened, and obviously more desperate than criminal. The horse he had stolen was worth more than Edmund could earn in 3 years of honest labor, which meant his theft was technically a capital crime regardless of his motivations. Roderick had spent hours before that first sentencing, reviewing legal precedents, consulting with colleagues, and searching for any alternative to execution that would satisfy both legal requirements and moral sensibilities. He had found none. The law was clear, the evidence was overwhelming, and his duty was to apply existing statutes rather than create new ones based on personal feelings about proportional justice. "Edmund Miller," he had said, his voice sounding strange and formal in the echoing courtroom. "You have been found guilty of felony theft, as defined by statute and precedent. The court sentences you to death by hanging, sentence to be carried out at dawn 3 days hence. May God have mercy on your soul." Edmund had collapsed as if Roderick's words were a physical blow, which in a very real sense they were. The boy's mother had screamed, his father had wept, and Roderick had felt something inside himself die along with his belief that law and justice were synonymous concepts. That night, Roderick had gotten drunk for the first time in his adult life, not in celebration but in a futile attempt to drown the sound of Edmund's mother screaming. It hadn't worked. 23 years later he could still hear her voice, along with the voices of 311 other family members who had watched him sentence their loved ones to death for crimes that seemed to require punishment, but not necessarily execution. The courtroom was already filling with spectators when Roderick took his seat behind the massive oak bench that served as both furniture and symbol of legal authority. Medieval trials were public events, partly because transparency was considered important for maintaining faith in the justice system, but mostly because watching other people's legal troubles was one of the few forms of entertainment available to people whose lives offered few opportunities for excitement. Thomas Miller was brought in first, flanked by guards who looked like they would rather be doing anything else. Thomas was younger than Roderick had expected, probably in his 20s, with the kind of hollow-eyed look that came from chronic hunger and perpetual worry. His clothes were patched and repatched, his hands were stained with honest work, and he carried himself with the defeated posture of someone who had already accepted that his story would not have a happy ending. The prosecution's case was straightforward and devastating. Thomas had been caught with stolen grain, had admitted to taking it, and had no legal defense beyond necessity, which was not recognized as a valid justification for theft under existing statutes. The grain's value exceeded the threshold for capital punishment, and there were no mitigating circumstances that would reduce the severity of the crime under current law. Thomas's defense, such as it was, consisted mainly of explaining his circumstances in the hope that Roderick would find some legal loophole that would allow mercy to triumph over statute. Thomas's wife had died in childbirth the previous year, leaving him with 3 children under the age of 7. His crops had failed due to unusually wet weather. His savings had been exhausted paying for his wife's medical care, and his children were literally starving. He had taken the grain not for profit but for survival. not as a criminal enterprise, but as a desperate act of paternal responsibility. Roderick listened to Thomas's explanation with the professional sympathy of someone who had heard similar stories hundreds of times before. Every person he had sentenced to death had reasons for their crimes: poverty, desperation, ignorance, passion, or simple bad luck. Medieval society produced criminals the way swamps produced mosquitoes, predictably, reliably, and in numbers that suggested systemic rather than individual problems. Thomas Miller, Roderick heard himself say, his voice carrying the formal authority that had become second nature after 2 decades of judicial pronouncements. You have confessed to the crime of theft as defined by statute. The value of the property stolen exceeds the threshold established by law for capital punishment. While the court acknowledges the difficult circumstances that led to your crime, the law provides no exception for necessity as a defense against theft of this magnitude. Thomas's face went pale as he realized where this was heading. Roderick continued with the mechanical precision of someone who had delivered similar sentences so many times that the words had become automatic. The court therefore sentences you to death by hanging, sentence to be carried out tomorrow at dawn. May God have mercy on your soul, and may your death serve as a reminder to others that property rights must be respected regardless of personal circumstances. The courtroom erupted in the usual mixture of gasps, sobs, and satisfied murmurs that accompanied death sentences. Thomas's father stood up and shouted something about justice and mercy that Roderick pretended not to hear, while Thomas himself simply stood there looking stunned, as if he couldn't quite process the fact that his attempt to feed his children had just cost him his life. Roderick called for order and moved on to the next case, because medieval court schedules didn't allow time for processing the emotional impact of capital sentences. Margaret Whitmore was brought in looking defiant rather than defeated, which Roderick found both admirable and strategically unwise. Medieval juries were more likely to recommend mercy for defendants who appeared appropriately penitent, and defiance was often interpreted as evidence of moral corruption that justified severe punishment. Margaret's case was more complex than Thomas's because adultery was harder to prove than theft, and the evidence against her was largely circumstantial. Several neighbors had testified about her suspicious behavior, her husband had described their deteriorating relationship, and her alleged lover had confessed under questioning that they had been intimate. However, there were no direct witnesses to adultery, and Margaret herself had refused to confess despite considerable pressure to do so. Under different circumstances, the lack of definitive proof might have provided reasonable doubt sufficient for acquittal. Unfortunately, medieval legal systems operated under different evidentiary standards than modern ones, and the testimony of multiple witnesses about suspicious behavior was often considered sufficient to establish guilt for crimes that were difficult to observe directly. Margaret's defense was that she had been visiting her alleged lover's house to provide nursing care for his elderly mother, who was suffering from a wasting disease that required constant attention. The timing of her visits, the secretive nature of her behavior, and the deterioration of her marriage were all explained by her commitment to caring for a dying woman whose own family was unable to provide adequate support. It was a plausible explanation that would have created reasonable doubt in a modern courtroom. But medieval juries were less concerned with absolute proof than with community standards of behavior and the need to maintain social order. Margaret had violated expected norms of wifely conduct, had caused scandal in the community, and had failed to demonstrate appropriate submission to marital authority. Whether she had technically committed adultery was less important than whether her behavior threatened the stability of family structures that medieval society depended on. Roderick reviewed the evidence and found himself in the familiar position of applying laws that seemed designed more for social control than individual justice. Margaret might be innocent of adultery, but she was certainly guilty of behavior that challenged conventional expectations about women's roles in marriage and society. Under medieval law, challenging social expectations was often indistinguishable from committing crimes. Margaret Whitmore, Roderick pronounced, "You have been charged with adultery as defined by statute and precedent. While the evidence against you is largely circumstantial, the testimony of multiple witnesses establishes a pattern of behavior inconsistent with marital fidelity and social order. The court finds you guilty of adultery and sentences you to death by beheading, sentence to be carried out tomorrow at dawn." Margaret's reaction was different from Thomas's. Instead of collapse, she straightened her shoulders and looked directly at Roderick, with an expression that suggested she understood exactly what had just happened, and was not particularly surprised by it. Her husband looked relieved, her alleged lover's family looked vindicated, and the crowd looked satisfied that social order had been properly maintained. Roderick felt the familiar combination of professional satisfaction and personal revulsion that accompanied successful prosecution of cases where legal justice and moral justice pointed in different directions. Margaret had been convicted according to law and evidence, but Roderick suspected that she was probably innocent of the specific crime she had been charged with, and certainly innocent of anything that deserved death as punishment. The final case of the day was Brother Francis, whose trial had attracted unusual attention because intellectual heresy cases were relatively rare, and because Francis himself was widely respected in the community. The courtroom was packed with clergy, scholars, and curious townspeople who wanted to witness what amounted to a theological debate with potentially fatal consequences. Francis's alleged crime consisted of letters he had written to fellow theologians questioning certain aspects of church doctrine, about the nature of salvation, the authority of Scripture, and the relationship between divine will and human reason. The letters had been intercepted by church authorities, analyzed by theological experts, and determined to contain ideas that deviated from orthodox teaching in ways that could be construed as heretical. The prosecution's case was that Francis had questioned divinely established truths, undermined church authority, and potentially led others into theological error. The letters were submitted as evidence, along with expert testimony from church officials who explained why Francis's ideas were dangerous to spiritual and social order. Francis's defense was that he had been engaged in legitimate theological inquiry designed to deepen understanding of divine truth rather than undermine it. He argued that questioning and discussion were essential components of scholarly investigation, that his letters contained no attacks on fundamental Christian doctrine, and that intellectual inquiry should be distinguished from heretical rebellion. Roderick found himself listening to a debate about the relationship between faith and reason that would have been fascinating in an academic setting, but was deeply disturbing in a legal one, where the outcome would determine whether a good man lived or died. Francis was clearly guilty of asking questions that church authorities found uncomfortable, but whether that constituted heresy seemed to depend more on political considerations than theological ones. The evidence was clear. Francis had written the letters. The letters contained ideas that deviated from orthodox doctrine, and deviation from orthodox doctrine could be legally defined as heresy. The fact that Francis's ideas were reasonable, scholarly, and motivated by genuine religious devotion was legally irrelevant, because the law was concerned with maintaining doctrinal conformity rather than protecting intellectual freedom. "Brother Francis," Roderick said, his voice heavy with the accumulated weight of 313 death sentences, "you have been charged with heresy as defined by canon law and civil statute. The court finds that your letters contain ideas that deviate from established church doctrine in ways that constitute heretical thinking as legally defined. While the court acknowledges your scholarly intentions and your devotion to Christian service, the law requires that doctrinal deviation be punished regardless of motivation. The court sentences you to death by burning, sentence to be carried out tomorrow at dawn." Francis received his death sentence with the same calm dignity he had maintained throughout the trial, nodding slightly as if Roderick had just confirmed something he had already known. The monk's acceptance of his fate was somehow more disturbing than the desperate reactions of the other defendants, because it suggested that Francis understood the legal and political forces that had doomed him and harbored no illusions about the relationship between justice and law. 3 cases, 3 death sentences, 3 human lives that would end because Roderick had followed legal precedent rather than moral intuition. It was, as he had predicted, a typical day in medieval jurisprudence. That evening, Roderick sat in his private chambers with a cup of wine that had grown warm while he stared out the window at the town square where tomorrow's executions would take place. The executioner's block was already in position, surrounded by the staging area where crowds would gather to witness the administration of justice. From his window, Roderick could see the gallows being prepared for Thomas, the block being sharpened for Margaret, and the stake being assembled for Francis. He had presided over hundreds of executions during his career, but he had never actually watched one. Judges were not required to witness the carrying out of sentences they imposed, and Roderick had always found reasons to be elsewhere when his legal decisions were transformed into physical reality. He told himself this was professional detachment, but he suspected it was moral cowardice. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, for the first time in 23 years, Roderick planned to watch the executions he had ordered and confront the full consequences of his judicial decisions. He was not sure why he felt compelled to do this, but he knew that he could not continue sentencing people to death without understanding what death actually looked like when it was administered by the state in his name. The knock on his chamber door came just after midnight. Roderick opened it to find Brother Francis, still wearing the simple brown robe of his monastic order, accompanied by two guards who looked embarrassed about their assignment. "Lord Justice," Francis said with a slight bow, "I wonder if I might speak with you privately before tomorrow's proceedings. I have no intention of appealing my sentence or requesting clemency, but I would appreciate the opportunity to discuss certain matters that may be relevant to your understanding of today's judgment." Roderick dismissed the guards and invited Francis into his chambers, pouring wine for both of them from a bottle he had been saving for a special occasion that now seemed unlikely to arrive. They sat across from each other in chairs positioned near the window that looked out over tomorrow's execution site. Two men on opposite sides of a legal decision that would end one of their lives in a few hours. "I want you to know," Francis began, "that I bear you no ill will for today's sentence. You applied the law as it exists, and I violated that law as it is currently interpreted. The fact that I believe the law to be unjust and the interpretation to be flawed does not change the legal reality of my situation." Roderick found himself studying Francis's face, looking for signs of fear, anger, or desperation that would make the monk's approaching death seem more real and immediate. Instead, he found only the kind of peaceful resignation that suggested Francis had made his peace with mortality long before his trial. "Do you truly feel no anger toward me?" Roderick asked. "I am the person who will be responsible for your death. You are the person who pronounced my death sentence according to existing law." Francis corrected gently. "The people responsible for my death are the ones who created laws that make intellectual inquiry a capital crime, the ones who chose to prosecute me for asking questions, and the ones who maintain a system where political orthodoxy is more important than truth. You are simply the instrument through which that system operates." They talked through the night about law and justice, faith and reason, individual responsibility and systemic injustice. Francis was as intelligent and thoughtful in private conversation as his letters had suggested, and Roderick found himself wondering what kind of contributions the monk might have made to theological scholarship if he had lived in a society that valued intellectual inquiry over doctrinal conformity. As dawn approached, Francis stood to leave, but paused at the door to offer Roderick a final observation. "The tragedy of your position," Francis said, "is not that you sentence innocent people to death, but that you sentence them knowing they are innocent and feeling powerless to do anything about it. You have become complicit in injustice, not through cruelty or corruption, but through the simple act of doing your job competently in a system designed to produce unjust outcomes. How do you bear that knowledge?" Roderick asked. "By remembering that systems are created by human beings and can be changed by human beings. Today's injustice is not permanent unless we choose to make it so. Perhaps someday judges will have the authority to consider mercy as well as law, and men like Thomas will not die for the crime of being hungry." Francis left, and Roderick prepared for the day's executions with a heavy heart and a clear understanding that he was about to watch 3 people die because he had been unwilling or unable to choose justice over law. The executions proceeded with the mechanical efficiency that medieval society had developed for transforming legal decisions into physical reality. Thomas died quietly, Margaret died bravely, and Francis died peacefully, each of them demonstrating more dignity in death than the legal system had shown them in life. Roderick watched all 3 executions from his chamber window, forcing himself to witness the consequences of his judicial decisions without the comfortable distance that had allowed him to sleep at night for 23 years. He saw Thomas's children weeping for their father, Margaret's defiant final words about the corruption of justice, and Francis's prayer for forgiveness for those who were killing him. That night, Roderick drafted his letter of resignation from the bench, citing health concerns and the need to pursue private interests. He could not continue serving as a judge in a system that required him to choose between law and justice, because he had finally understood that the choice itself was a form of moral corruption that he was no longer willing to accept. He spent his remaining years writing legal treatises that argued for judicial reforms, legislative changes, and constitutional protections that would not be implemented for several centuries. His work was largely ignored during his lifetime, but it contributed to theoretical foundations for legal systems that would eventually recognize the importance of balancing law with justice, precedent with mercy, and social order with individual rights. Roderick died at the age of 72. Having spent the last 15 years of his life trying to undo the intellectual and moral damage caused by his 23 years as a medieval judge. His epitaph read simply, "He learned to choose justice over law," which was perhaps the most hopeful statement anyone could make about the possibility of moral growth in impossible circumstances. The judicial system continued to function after Roderick's resignation, because medieval society needed judges just as it needed executioners, tax collectors, and other administrators of institutional authority. His replacement was a younger man who approached the law with the same idealistic enthusiasm Roderick had once possessed, and who would presumably undergo the same gradual transformation from idealist to cynic that seemed inevitable for anyone who spent enough time working within systems designed to maintain injustice. The cycle continued, as it always had and always would, until someone with sufficient power decided that legal systems should serve justice rather than simply maintaining existing arrangements of authority and privilege. Roderick's story was neither tragic nor triumphant. It was simply the story of someone who discovered that institutional loyalty and moral integrity were not always compatible, and who eventually chose integrity over institutional advancement. In a world where good choices were often unavailable, Roderick had eventually learned to make the best choices he could manage, even when those choices came at considerable personal cost. Perhaps that was the most anyone could hope for in a profession that existed at the intersection of human law and divine justice, where the requirements of earthly authority often conflicted with the demands of moral conscience. Father Benedict had always believed that dying well was more important than living comfortably. But as he sat in his cell watching the first light of dawn creep through the barred window, he was discovering that believing something in theory and experiencing it in practice were remarkably different propositions. Today was the day he would die for the crime of suggesting that perhaps God's truth was more complex than church doctrine acknowledged, and he was finding that philosophical acceptance of mortality was considerably easier when mortality was still theoretical. The cell was approximately 6 feet by 8 feet, furnished with a straw mattress that had seen better decades, a wooden bucket that served purposes Benedict preferred not to contemplate, and a small wooden cross that had been carved by some previous occupant, who apparently had more artistic talent than Benedict possessed. The walls were stone, the floor was stone, and the ceiling was stone, creating an environment that felt less like temporary housing and more like premature burial. Benedict had been imprisoned for 3 months while church authorities investigated his letters, consulted with theological experts, and prepared their case for heresy charges. 3 months was long enough to exhaust most of the mental and spiritual exercises that might help someone cope with extended incarceration, but not quite long enough to achieve the kind of peaceful resignation that longer-term prisoners sometimes developed. He had reached the awkward stage of imprisonment where despair had worn off, but acceptance had not yet arrived. The charges against him were technically accurate. He had written letters questioning certain aspects of church doctrine. He had suggested that some religious truths might be more nuanced than official teaching acknowledged, and he had engaged in the kind of intellectual inquiry that church authorities considered dangerous to doctrinal orthodoxy. What the charges failed to capture was that Benedict's questions had been motivated by genuine religious devotion rather than rebellious skepticism, and that his goal had been to deepen understanding of divine truth rather than undermine it. Benedict's journey to the executioner's block had begun with what he had thought was a simple theological question. If God was truly omniscient and omnipotent, How could human beings be held morally responsible for choices that God had foreseen and could have prevented? It was the kind of question that theology students had been asking for centuries, but Benedict had made the mistake of asking it in writing, in letters to fellow scholars, during a period when church authorities were particularly sensitive about challenges to doctrinal authority. His letters had been intercepted, analyzed, and determined to contain ideas that deviated from orthodox teaching in ways that could be construed as heretical. The fact that Benedict's ideas were reasonable, scholarly, and motivated by genuine religious curiosity was legally irrelevant, because the law was concerned with maintaining doctrinal conformity rather than protecting intellectual freedom. The trial had been a foregone conclusion. Medieval heresy proceedings were designed more for demonstrating the consequences of doctrinal deviation than for determining guilt or innocence according to any meaningful standard of evidence. Benedict had been permitted to explain his intentions and defend his ideas, but the outcome had been determined before the proceedings began. Now, with less than 6 hours remaining before his execution, Benedict was trying to use his final morning productively. He had written letters to his family explaining his love for them and his regret that his intellectual curiosity had caused them pain. He had composed a final statement about his beliefs and his hope that someday the church would be strong enough to tolerate questions rather than silencing questioners. He had prayed extensively, though he was not entirely sure what he was praying for. Salvation, forgiveness, courage, or simply the strength to die with dignity. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside his cell announced the arrival of his final visitor, Father Marcus, the elderly priest who had served as Benedict's confessor and spiritual advisor during his imprisonment. Marcus was one of the few people who had access to condemned prisoners, and he had visited Benedict regularly throughout the 3 months of incarceration, providing spiritual comfort and serving as a connection to the outside world. "Good morning, Benedict," Marcus said as the guard unlocked the cell door. "I've brought you some bread and wine for a final communion, and I thought we might spend some time in prayer before the proceedings begin." Benedict accepted the bread and wine gratefully, not because he was particularly hungry, but because sharing communion with Marcus felt like participating in something sacred and timeless that transcended the immediate circumstances of his approaching death. Medieval society might be about to kill him for asking inconvenient questions, but God presumably understood the difference between intellectual curiosity and spiritual rebellion. "Are you afraid?" Marcus asked as they shared the communion elements. "Terrified," Benedict admitted. "Not of death itself, necessarily, but of dying badly, of showing fear or anger or despair that would discredit the ideas I'm dying for, of giving the crowd the kind of spectacle they expect rather than the kind of witness I hope to provide." "Fear is not incompatible with courage," Marcus observed. "Courage is acting rightly despite fear, not acting without fear. The martyrs were afraid too. They were simply more afraid of betraying their principles than of dying for them. They prayed together as the sun rose higher, and the sounds of activity in the town square indicated that preparations for the execution were proceeding on schedule. Benedict could hear the crowd gathering, vendors setting up stalls to sell food and drink to spectators, and the general bustle of a community preparing for what it considered entertainment rather than tragedy. The irony was not lost on Benedict that his death would serve multiple purposes. It would demonstrate the consequences of challenging church authority, provide entertainment for people whose lives offered few opportunities for excitement, and reinforce social order by showing what happened to individuals who questioned institutional orthodoxy. He was being killed not just for his specific ideas, but for the general principle that ideas themselves could be dangerous if they challenged existing arrangements of power and authority. At mid-morning, the guards arrived to escort Benedict to the execution site. They were not unkind. Medieval jailers had learned that condemned prisoners who were treated with basic human dignity were less likely to cause problems during their final moments. But they were also not particularly sympathetic. They had a job to do, and that job involved ensuring that Benedict arrived at the stake on schedule and in condition to be executed efficiently. Benedict was surprised by how normal everything looked as they walked through the town streets toward the square. People were going about their daily business, shopping, working, conducting the ordinary activities of medieval life. as if today were no different from any other day. Children played in the streets, merchants haggled with customers, and craftsmen worked at their trades, all seemingly oblivious to the fact that a man was about to die for the crime of thinking dangerous thoughts. The disconnect between the ordinariness of daily life and the extraordinary nature of what was about to happen struck Benedict as profoundly surreal. He was experiencing the most significant day of his life, his last day, but for everyone else it was just Thursday. His death would be a brief interruption in their routine, a momentary diversion from their normal concerns, and then life would continue as if he had never existed. The execution site was already crowded when they arrived. Benedict estimated that perhaps 200 people had gathered to watch him die, which was probably about average for a heresy execution. Murder trials drew larger crowds, but theological crimes were considered less exciting than violent ones, and Benedict's case had not generated the kind of public interest that would attract spectators from neighbouring towns. The stake had been assembled in the centre of the square, surrounded by bundles of wood that would serve as fuel for the fire that would kill him. It was a remarkably simple apparatus for ending a human life. Just a wooden post, some rope to secure the victim, and enough combustible material to generate sufficient heat to cause death by burning. Medieval society had developed efficient methods for most forms of execution, but burning required no particular skill or equipment beyond basic carpentry and fire management. Benedict was struck by how businesslike the entire operation appeared. The executioner, a hooded figure whose professional anonymity allowed him to avoid the social consequences of his work, was checking the ropes, adjusting the position of the wood, and generally preparing for Benedict's death with the kind of methodical efficiency that someone might bring to any skilled trade. There was no malice in his preparations, no apparent emotional investment in the outcome, just professional competence applied to the task of killing people for the state. The crowd's mood was festive rather than solemn, which Benedict found more disturbing than outright hostility would have been. People were treating his execution as entertainment, bringing food and drink, chatting with friends, and generally behaving as if they were attending a fair rather than a funeral. Some spectators were probably genuinely interested in seeing justice done, but most appeared to be there simply because watching someone die was more exciting than whatever else they had planned for Thursday morning. Benedict was given an opportunity to make a final statement, which was traditional for condemned prisoners, and served several purposes. It allowed them to confess their crimes and ask for forgiveness, which was good for community morale. It provided entertainment for the crowd, which was good for maintaining public interest in justice. And it gave the authorities a chance to demonstrate their mercy in allowing the condemned to speak, which was good for maintaining the appearance of fairness in legal proceedings. Benedict had prepared remarks that he hoped would accomplish several goals: explain his genuine religious devotion, clarify that his questions had been motivated by faith rather than rebellion, and encourage others to continue asking the kinds of questions that had led to his death. He was not naive enough to think that his words would change anything immediately, but he hoped they might plant seeds of doubt about the wisdom of executing people for intellectual curiosity. "My friends and neighbours," Benedict began, his voice carrying clearly across the square, "I stand before you today condemned to die for the crime of asking questions about God's truth. I want you to know that these questions were born not of rebellion against the Church, but of love for God and desire to understand divine will more deeply." The crowd was unusually quiet, which Benedict took as a sign that at least some people were listening to his words, rather than simply waiting for him to finish talking, so the execution could begin. He continued with the statement he had crafted during his months in prison, trying to balance honesty about his beliefs with awareness that his words would be the last thing many people remembered about him. "I do not ask you to agree with my ideas, but I do ask you to remember that questions are not enemies of faith. They are tools for deepening faith. The God who created human reason surely intended for us to use it in service of understanding divine truth. If my death serves any purpose, let it be as a reminder that truth is strong enough to withstand questioning, and that faith is not threatened by doubt, but strengthened by it." Benedict concluded his statement with a prayer for his accusers, his judges, and the community that was about to watch him die. He had spent considerable time deciding whether to include this prayer, because he was not sure whether his forgiveness would be seen as noble or condescending. In the end, he had decided that forgiveness was the most important message he could leave. both for his own spiritual preparation for death and for the possibility that someone in the crowd might be moved to reconsider their own relationship to justice and mercy. The actual process of being tied to the stake and prepared for burning was more complicated than Benedict had expected. The executioner and his assistants had to position him correctly, secure the rope so that he would not fall but would also not be able to escape, and arrange the wood so that the fire would burn efficiently without creating excessive smoke that might interfere with the spectator's view of the proceedings. Benedict found the technical preparations oddly comforting, because they gave him something to focus on besides the approaching reality of being burned alive. The executioner worked with professional competence, treating Benedict with the kind of respectful efficiency that suggested he took no personal pleasure in his work, but was committed to doing it properly. Benedict appreciated the man's professionalism, even though that professionalism was being applied to the task of killing him. "Is there anything you need?" the executioner asked quietly, speaking directly to Benedict for the first time. "Water, additional time for prayer, messages for family members?" Benedict was touched by the question, which suggested that even professional killers sometimes felt the weight of their work and tried to minimize the suffering they were required to inflict. He requested a few additional minutes for silent prayer, which the executioner granted without consulting with the judicial authorities who were overseeing the execution. Benedict used those minutes to prepare mentally and spiritually for death by fire, which he knew would be painful regardless of how efficiently the execution was conducted. He prayed for courage, for forgiveness, and for the grace to die in a way that would honor the ideas he had died for. He also prayed for his family, his friends, and even his accusers, asking God to help all of them find peace in the aftermath of his death. The fire was lit with the kind of ceremony that suggested medieval society took public executions seriously as demonstrations of legal authority and social order. A church official blessed the proceedings, a court representative read the charges one final time, and the executioner applied flame to the kindling with the solemnity appropriate for an official act of state violence. Benedict had wondered whether he would panic when the flames actually reached him, but he found instead a strange sense of peace that he attributed to divine grace, months of mental preparation, or simply the human capacity to accept even terrible circumstances when they become inevitable. The pain was intense but somehow manageable, perhaps because he had spent so much time anticipating it that the reality could hardly be worse than his imagination. The crowd's reaction to his death was mixed. Some spectators seemed satisfied that justice had been done and social order had been maintained. Others appeared disturbed by watching a obviously decent man die for crimes that seemed more intellectual than moral. A few people left before the execution was completed, apparently finding the reality of watching someone burn alive less entertaining than they had anticipated. Benedict's last conscious thought was a prayer of gratitude for his life, his faith, his opportunity to serve God through scholarship, and even for the chance to die as a witness to the importance of intellectual freedom. He had lived to see his ideas condemned and suppressed, but he died believing that truth was stronger than the forces trying to silence it, and that someday other people would ask the same questions that had led to his death. The fire burned for approximately 20 minutes before Benedict's suffering ended, which was considered efficient for a heresy execution. His body was burned completely, and his ashes were scattered to prevent his grave from becoming a site of pilgrimage for others who might be inspired by his example. Medieval authorities understood that martyrs could be more dangerous dead than alive, and they took precautions to minimize the possibility that Benedict's death would inspire others to similar acts of intellectual rebellion. The crowd dispersed quickly once the execution was complete, returning to their normal daily activities as if nothing significant had happened. The execution site was cleaned up, the stake was dismantled, and the square returned to its usual function as a marketplace where people bought and sold goods rather than witnessing the administration of justice. Benedict's family received permission to hold a funeral service, though they were required to emphasize his submission to lawful authority rather than his commitment to intellectual inquiry. His letters were destroyed by church authorities, though copies had been made and hidden by sympathetic scholars who believed his ideas deserved preservation despite their official condemnation. Within a few years, Benedict's name was largely forgotten by the general population. though his ideas continued to circulate quietly among scholars who shared his commitment to theological inquiry. His death served its intended purpose of demonstrating the consequences of challenging church authority, but it also served the unintended purpose of inspiring others to ask similar questions about the relationship between faith and reason, authority and truth, orthodoxy and intellectual freedom. Benedict's story was neither tragic nor triumphant. It was simply the story of someone who chose to die for his ideas rather than abandon them, and who trusted that truth would eventually prove stronger than the forces trying to suppress it. In a world where good choices were often unavailable, he had chosen integrity over survival, and perhaps that was the most anyone could hope for in a society that valued conformity over curiosity and orthodoxy over truth. His death marked the end of one man's quest for deeper understanding of divine truth, but it also marked the beginning of a tradition of intellectual martyrdom that would continue for centuries as other thinkers discovered that some questions were too important to leave unasked, regardless of the personal consequences of asking them. Benedict died believing that his death would serve a purpose, and perhaps in ways he could not have imagined it did.